As you can see then, Patriot and liberal internationalist, the life of Ahmed or Ahmed Robenson. I will address the question at the end, Patriot or liberal internationalist. But first of all, let me talk a bit about, well, this is the gentleman concerned, Ahmed Robenson, a figure quite well known in Turkey today, particularly because of his connections with the sports club Galatasaray. He was the first goalkeeper for the Galatasaray football team when Galatasaray entered the Istanbul Sunday League in 1905, which is the league, the successor to that league now is what you have in Turkey in the football in the first division there now. Ahmed Robenson then was famous not just for football, but for other sports connected with Galatasaray Sports Club, basketball in particular, but not exclusively basketball. And also he played an important role in introducing scouting to Turkey, or to the Ottoman Empire, as it was still at that time. So I will be touching on those issues, which is the parts of Ahmed Robenson's life which is quite well known, but I will also touch on other issues as well which are less well known, but which I think are also important. The problem is that there is much misinformation about Ahmed Robenson and his life. There is a lot of government propaganda which continues right through to today. And, interestingly, some of the information about Ahmed Robenson's life has been manipulated and intentionally distorted by Ahmed Robenson himself. Why is that the case? I will come to that as well in the course of my talk. So, this is the book. Here are flyers of the book, which you are welcome to pick up at the end of today. And actually, I can do even better. I have now an advance copy of the book, which is due to be published in September of this year. So this book, Whispers Across Continents in Search of the Robensons, Ahmed Robenson is one of the key characters in this book. There are at least 2 chapters which focus on his life, but there are other characters in the Robenson family dealt with in some detail in this book as well. I have personal ties with the family. One of my good friends, I lived in Istanbul for 20 years, and one of my good friends, Ahmed Ceylan, is the great-great-grandson of Ahmed Robenson's father. And Ahmed Robenson's father was Spencer Robenson, and he was originally a tenant farmer living in Lincolnshire in mid-late Victorian England before he emigrated to India, British Raj, after the death of his wife, and would later remarry, and several children would come from his second marriage, including Ahmed Robenson. It's been a fascinating journey exploring the Robenson family. I feel privileged to be in touch with members of the family, including the great-grandson, Spencer Robenson, who is living in the UK now, who unfortunately couldn't quite make it to the talk today. So it's a story which also includes, as well as India, Constantinople, it includes Germany and the United States, as well as the Robensons who remained in Britain. Okay. Now, here's an example of a bit of propaganda then. This is a children's book, Çizgi Roman, a cartoon book, Galatasaray, and the details of Osman Galip and the Robensons, the heroes fighting in Çanakkale in the First World War. So, you know, this is a story then, this is a narrative which school children, even to today, are reading about, learning about. The sort of myths, mythology associated with the Robensons and Ahmed Robenson in particular. So there's a lot of propaganda out there. In this cartoon booklet, which is referred to by various people, they refer to the Robenson family, Ahmed Robenson's father, Spencer Robenson, correct. Living in India, correct. and his wife Sarah. Wrong. There is no Sarah. I don't know where that comes from. And they convert to Islam and come to Istanbul. Not strictly correct, but the mother of Ahmed Robenson does convert to Islam, one of the first ladies to convert to Islam in Victorian England, Hannah, and she would come to Istanbul and would be known there as Fatima Robenson. Turkish historians have sort of compounded these mistakes. Rifat Bali, quite a famous historian, refers to Ahmed Robenson's mother as Lady Sarah. Lady Sarah. The Istanbul Encyclopedia, a pretty important source, a respected source, refers to Ahmed Robenson's father as Sir Rose. Sir Rose. Completely wrong. Even more interesting, the Ottoman Archives and Turkish historians, several Turkish historians using these Ottoman Archives, looking at the Robinson family, refer then to Ahmed Robenson and his brothers as the sons of this gentleman, Abdullah Quilliam. Very famous, set up one of the first functioning mosques in Liverpool in the 1880s, and so according to the Ottoman Archives, which Turkish historians are making use of, yes, William, who had close contacts with Sultan Abdulhamid II, very close, who was given the title of Sheikh al-Islam, the leader of the Islamic community in England, Britain in the 1890s. There is this argument then in the Ottoman Archives, Robenson brothers were sons of Quilliam, that Hannah Robenson had a relationship with Quilliam, and the sons were the products of them. And that Ahmed Robenson was born then in Liverpool. So if you look at Wikipedia, or Wikipedia, the Turkish version, you will see Ahmed Robenson born in Liverpool. Wrong. This is an interview that Ahmed Robenson, quite an elderly gentleman by the time in the mid-1960s, this is the young Ahmed Robenson. Here's the lady who interviewed Ahmed Robenson. This was in the United States, by the Hudson River, the Lyndhurst Estate, in the town of Tarrytown. I'll come back to that later. She interviewed Ahmed Robenson, and Ahmed Robenson, this is where he sort of develops his argument. Yes, my family gave England prime ministers. They were connected to Cecil Rhodes, the guy, Rhodesia, famous one. My mother comes from a renowned family renowned in the fields of art, education, and literature. All totally wrong. Hannah Rhoda, notice the name, Rhodes. Hannah Rhoda, as she was born, that's Ahmed Robenson's mother, was born in Stepney in late 1854 in the slums of London's East End. Very poor family. She spent time as a baby in workhouses. Her father was a low-level merchant seaman who died at sea. Her grandfather was a bricklayer from Bethnal Green. This is the family background. And Hannah Rhoda would marry Spencer Robinson in 1880, would become Spencer Robinson's second wife, and the two would live together in India for several years until Spencer Robinson died in 1889. So, Ahmed Robenson was not born in Liverpool, he was born here. This is not Liverpool, as you can see. This is Kalimpong, in the foothills of the Himalayas, a hill station there. He was born there in May 1889, and he was christened Peel Harold Robinson. That is his original name, Peel Harold Robinson, the son of Spencer Robinson and Hannah Robinson. Spencer Robinson died, so Ahmed's father, died very soon after Ahmed was born, quite young then. He died in India in November 1889. I went to Kalimpong last year to try and track down his grave. I found the cemetery. there in Kalimpong, but unable to read the gravestones are being completely effaced, washed away with the winds, etc. But I was able to identify the cemetery anywhere where he was died, where he was buried. So the family, Hannah, and young children, including the very young Peel Harold Robenson, came back to England sometime in 1890 or 1891. Not quite sure of the dates, but certainly one of Ahmed's brothers was born in Bengal in 1890, according to the 1891 census. So they came back sometime after that. The family returned to Brighton, and Mrs. Robenson took up living, well, she started to run a guest house in quite a prestigious part of Brighton on Regency Square. So this is quite a prestigious part of Brighton at that time. And quite surprisingly, in November 1891, having converted to Islam in the mosque in Liverpool, so clearly she did have contacts with William Henry Abdullah William. Having converted to Islam, she married in the mosque in Liverpool Dr. Gulab Shah. Dr. Gulab Shah was supposedly a famous, distinguished Afghan warlord who had fought in the Second Anglo-Afghan War. And this was put in all the newspapers of the day, the Times, whatever. Important marriage, Dr. Gulab Shah, Mrs. Hannah Robenson. And the family moved to Constantinople. Dr. Gulab Shah was a charlatan. He was not an Afghan, he was not a warlord, he was an Indian eye doctor, oculist, who had married several women in England to get their money, it seems, under false pretenses, and this was well known by the British Embassy in Constantinople. And I read in the National Archives correspondence, including letters sent to the office of the Prime Minister, first of all it's Gladstone and then Salisbury, referring to the activities, the notoriety, the blackguard, the scoundrel Gulab Shah, whose real name was Ilihai Bosch. So, life for Hannah in Constantinople quickly deteriorated, and she was desperate for a divorce as soon as possible. This guy is an imposter, he's beating me up, he says he's Jack the Ripper, he's threatening to do damage to my children, including Ahmed Robenson at the time. And she appealed for support to the Grand Vizier, to the British Embassy, and the family did get support from Sultan Abdul Hamid II himself, who gave money, financial support to the family. Quite important that a lady, she had converted to Islam, was there in Constantinople appealing for help, and the Sultan and his advisors took pity on her. Also, other people took pity on the family. This gentleman, Mustafa Zeki Pasha, who was very well known, Field Marshal of the Imperial Arsenal, in charge of all the military schools in Constantinople at that time, and a trusted, one of the Sultan's most trusted military political advisors. And because of the Mustafa Zeki Pasha, he took pity on the family as well. One of the daughters, one of Ahmed Robenson's sister, Maud, or Adile, was sheltered by Mustafa Zeki Pasha, brought her up for a few years in his villa with his daughters. And the young Ahmed Robenson and his other brothers would be sent free of charge to the prestigious Kulali military school in Constantinople. It would only be later that Ahmed Robenson would be taken out of the school by his mother, who said, I don't want my son to become a military officer, and he would be transferred to the Galatasaray Lise, Galatasaray High School. I heard mention of Boris Johnson in the previous talk. Let's get a Boris Johnson reference here. Today's the day. Mustafa Zeki Pasha, of course, if you may know, one of his daughters, Sabiha, married Ali Kemal. And Ali Kemal was the great-grandfather of Boris Johnson. And the relatives, I've been in touch with the Kunar Alps, who are direct relatives of Mustafa Zeki Pasha, and they, one of them is his story, one of them is a former ambassador, and the family is still very much closely in touch with the Johnsons. Stanley Johnson goes there quite often, and I've seen pictures of them together. So, you know, the Johnsons and the Kunar Alps via Mustafa Zeki Pasha then very closely related together. Okay, now Ahmed Robenson, yes, he became a famous sportsman, scouting, etc. But I found evidence that in his youth, so we're talking of when he was 18, 19, it seems that he was doing a number of other jobs for a while, for a short period. One is associated with the slide here. For a brief period at least, he was a pay clerk in the central post office in Para, in Constantinople. And there, he communicated with the Union factory in Birmingham, obviously fluent in English, and he was communicating with the Union factory in Birmingham to order the first bicycles for the Ottoman post office. So here we are, Ottoman post office, some of the first bicycles used by the post office. Ahmed Robenson then was directly involved in sending letters, communicating in this process. He also acted as a guide and translator in his youth. In particular, I read an article in the New York Times, 1909, where there was an article by the famous American journalist Herman Bernstein. He became the author of the book proving that the protocols of the learned elders of Zion were based on forged texts. The book that Hitler would try to use as propaganda, talking about Jewish conspiracy in the world. So Bernstein's a very famous journalist. He would interview many prestigious people at the time, Trotsky, Tolstoy, etc. Well, Ahmed Robenson was his guide and translator in the summer of 1909 in Constantinople, when Herman Bernstein had an interview with Sahib Mullah Effendi, the Sheikh al-Islam at the time in Constantinople, the head of the, below the Sultan, the Caliph, sort of the head of the religious community there. And so Ahmed Robenson playing quite an important role there on the side as a guide and translator. However, he is famously known, as I say in Turkey today, as a sportsman. There he is in the middle, in the white. This is the Galatasaray football team, 1908, 1909. This is the championship winning football team. They've got the shield there. They won that year, the shield. They won it several times the next few years. So, as goalkeeper, they won the title 3 times in that period, with Ahmed Robenson goalkeeping there. The Robensons, there's a sort of story going around, how was football introduced in the Ottoman Empire, and the role that Ahmed Robenson played in this. And there's one story going around that the Robenson kids, including Ahmed Robenson, in 1899, so Ahmed would be about 10 at the time, would suddenly appeared in the school grounds of Galatasaray Lycée, kicking around a leather football, which had been unheard of before. Leather football, they were kicking it around. And this sort of attracted the interest of other school kids around, what's this, what you're doing, whatever. And that is seen as one of the origins then of professional football, as opposed to rugby, which had been sort of played by some of the Levantines in Constantinople at that time. So, Ahmed Robenson graduated from Galatasaray Lycée, having transferred there from the Kumuli Military School, and became a sports teacher. Very popular sports teacher. He would organise field trips, take his students out, walk around the woods of Beykoz, there were still woods there then, or Karthane by the river, there were still nice lush green fields around the river there. And stories of these field trips, we can read memoirs of former students of Ahmed Robenson, and they came up with things like it was so fun for Ahmed Robenson to be our teacher. Half the class, half the time would be taken up with Ahmed Robenson telling us stories about sporting life in England, sporting life in the Ottoman Empire. He clearly had close links, bonds, attachment with his students. And he introduced basketball to Turkey, to the Ottoman Empire in 1911. He got hold of a book, the rules of basketball, translated it, and then tried to enact these rules in 1911. They had 2 wastepaper baskets, and they set them on different parts of the room, and there was an impromptu first game of basketball, which didn't last very long because most of the people got injured. They didn't know how to play the game properly. And this again has become a myth, a legend, but seems to be quite true. Ahmed Robenson also popularised other sports: field hockey, roller skating hockey, tennis, rowing, volleyball, you name it. Ahmed Robenson's there introducing these sports to the late Ottoman Empire. And remember, with the Balkan Wars of 1912 and 1913, and the very poor performance, let's say, of the Ottoman youth fighting in those wars, it was quite quickly the Committee of Union and Progress, the Young Turks quite quickly realised we need to have a healthy, strong youth to be able to fight in future wars. So a lot more emphasis was then placed on the importance of sports, healthy physical activities, and more attention then being given to children to play basketball, football, etc. And linked with that, we can also talk about the importance of scouting. This is a picture taken in 1915. Atatürk, Mustafa Kemal Atatürk here, and Ahmed Robenson here. And basically, this was taken in 1915, members of the General Inspectorate of the Ottoman Strength League. And what's all this about? Well, the first scout groups were set up by the Robenson brothers, Ahmed and his brother Abdul Rahman, around 1911. The exact dates when it was set up is not quite clear, but Ahmed Robenson did set up a scouting group based at the Galatasaray High School where he was teaching. And they also set up a Girl Guides group very quickly as well, so it wasn't just exclusively with boys. Like football, which was initially regarded with suspicion in the Ottoman Empire, football, Western outside influence, also scouting was initially regarded with suspicion. Baden-Powell had only set up his first scouting camp a few years earlier. And so Ahmed Robenson sort of used the English handbook of scouting. The children were dressed in the uniforms, shorts, tops, and this was regarded initially with great suspicion. Is this a secret, some sort of subtle attempt to promote Christianity in the Ottoman Empire? But again, once, post the Balkan Wars of 1912 and 1913, the poor performance of the Ottoman Empire there, again, scouting suddenly became seen as important for creating a healthy, strong, robust youth, and became linked with the whole concept of nation in arms, the concept of von der Goltz at that time, German military practitioner, who was talking about the need for a strong youth, a nation in arms. And with this then, you have the Turkish Strength Association set up in 1913, followed by the Ottoman Strength League, the example here, and then the Ottoman Youth League, where basically you had militarization to some extent of the scouting movement. It became compulsory for the scouts to take part in shooting exercises, other activities which linked more with the military. Which is not surprising with the start of war in 1914. It's happened the same in Britain as well. Boy Scouts were there guarding bridges in Britain. Baden-Powell wanted them to be in the trenches. Didn't get as far as that, but so one can understand the militarization of the scouting movement in the Ottoman Empire, just as it was in Britain. After the war, Ahmed Robenson survived the war, unlike two of his brothers. Abdul Rahman Robenson died on the Russian front, died of frostbite, gangrene, and his other brother Jakob, his death, quite mysterious, we're not quite sure about that. There are some sources which say he died missing in action in the Battle of Katia in the Sinai Desert by the Suez Canal in 1916. Other sources suggest that he was executed as a traitor. And he was trying to give secrets to the British. I have no direct evidence of that, and I treat Ottoman Archives with caution. Anyway, Ahmed Robenson served as a sledge instructor for the Ottoman Third Army in the First World War on the Russian front. And then, immediately after the war, he worked for these guys. Well, who are these? These are the government of the Southwest Caucasus. This was a government which set up in Kars at the end of the First World War. It was originally the Kars Islamic Council, and then the Kars Council, and then the government of Southwest Caucasus. It was an attempt by the Ottomans, you could argue, to try to keep influence in the Caucasus at the end of the First World War, when you had British occupying forces in the Caucasus, but you still had lots of Turks, as well as Armenians and Georgians in the neighbourhood, and this was an attempt, one can argue, to try to keep some sort of Ottoman influence in the region. Ahmed Robenson worked as official translator of the Southwest Caucasus government. He acted as an intermediary, translating to British authorities and the government of the Southwest Caucasus. In so doing, he was accused of being a spy by the British, spying for the Ottomans, and the Ottomans accused him of being a spy, spying the way around. So, and this was seen in the memoirs, for instance, of Kazım Karabekir, very famous general, Ottoman general. If you look at his memoirs, he refers to Ahmed Robenson. He says, very suspicious, this guy. I've got letters of his. He's sending letters to his family discussing the future of Istanbul, whether it will be an international city or whether the Americans take over. Let's open up an investigation into this family. Who is this Ahmed Robenson? Ahmed, well, we don't see any evidence what happened as a result of that. Nothing seemed to have happened, but certainly the suspicions of Kazım Karabekir were raised. Ahmed Robenson had, according to the British National Archives, intimate relations with the Minister for Post and Telegraphs of the government of Southwest Caucasus, the lady who you don't see up here, Miss Nina Yankovsky, and they would later marry. After the war, this is Taksim Stadium. This was built in where Gezi Park is now. And it was built after the First World War. It was built and hosted games in the 1920s and 1930s, right by Taksim Square. Ahmed Robenson was involved in the construction of the Taksim Stadium and organising the first sporting events. The inauguration of the Taksim Stadium, Ahmed Robenson was directly involved. He was trying to get sports clubs together to join. Many Turkish sports clubs boycotted what was known as the mini Olympics because they didn't like occupying authorities taking part in the games. They didn't like ethnic Russians taking part. So the ethnic Turkish clubs boycotted this opening ceremony in 1922, much to the annoyance of Ahmed Robenson. Ahmed Robenson in this period worked as a sports PE teacher for the YMCA in Beyoğlu, 40 Rue Kabristan, and for a brief period was president of the Galatasaray Sports Club in 1925. Conscious of the time, so I won't keep it too long. Here is a letter that Ahmed Robenson so it was really great to read, to get hold of some of his correspondence from members of his family. And this was a letter written in January 1924. You can see the address, 40 Rue Kabristan, YMCA, Beyoğlu. And this was to his half-sister, Gertrude, who was living in Germany at the time. And this was really Ahmed Robenson at his peak. And he can, maybe I'll read out briefly this paragraph. It says there, I am one of the leading men of all sports in the country, as well as one of the founders, and have some other business. I worked up an outstanding position, and I'm quite pleased of my works, which are prospering day by day. And in this time, Ahmed Robenson worked with this gentleman. This is Asa K. Jennings, the saviour of the Greeks in the evacuation of Smyrna, Izmir, in 1922. An American Methodist pastor, also working for the YMCA in the Ottoman Empire and Turkey, and he tried to set up the so-called Turkish American Clubs project, cooperation between the YMCA and what would become known as the Turkish government. Again, Ahmed Robenson is the official translator, official interpreter, translator, but again he's more than that. He acts as an intermediary. He butts into the conversation between Asa K. Jennings and the Turkish Education Minister. And again, those projects would not get off the ground. The Turkish nationalist groups, the Turkish Hers, or Turkish Ocaklar, prevented the YMCA constructing a sports and social facility in Ankara, and the Turkish American Clubs project collapsed, much again to the annoyance of Ahmed Robenson. Ahmed Robenson and Jennings also worked on the Smyrna Welfare Council project in Izmir, 1926 to 1928. To set up a social welfare program for Izmir. Again, Ahmed Robenson, interpreter, advisor, head of the council's PE committee. He provided one of the first modern sports fields in Turkey. He provided the first children's playground in Turkey. He distributed leaflets in French and Turkish pressing for clean pasteurized milk to be distributed to the children. Many of the children had died in the First World War due to contaminated milk products. Again though, he was denounced by local nationalists. How dare you send out these leaflets in French, why not just in Turkish? And again, the scheme, the Smyrna Welfare Council project would again later collapse due to nationalist opposition and the drying up of funds. So, a disillusioned Ahmed Robenson goes sometime in 1929 to the United States of America, to New York. He becomes a seller of Oriental rugs. He lives with his wife as lodgers and rented property. Life is going down now. He is no longer at his peak. By mid-1950s, he was a caretaker at the Lyndhurst estate in Tarrytown, New York, by the Hudson River. This was the property at one time of the robber baron J. Gould, who was the father of Helen Gould, who was linked with the YMCA and provided money for the building of Gould Hall in today's Robert College in Istanbul. After Helen Gould's death, the estate came into the hands of this lady, Anna Gould, who was a bit of a socialite, unlike her modest sister Helen. Anna had relationships with celebrities. One of her husbands was direct descendant of Talleyrand, Napoleon's foreign minister, and she was quite an eccentric. She lived most of her time in Paris, but whenever she was in New York, she insisted that the table should be prepared for her every evening for dinner, even if she was not at the Lyndhurst herself. She usually stayed at the Plaza Hotel in New York, but Ahmed Robenson and the others would have to prepare the table every night when she was in town, just in case she came to visit. And here we have Ahmed Robenson then in the Lyndhurst estate in the 1960s then, shortly before his death, and these are his relatives. So this is one of these, I can't remember which one it is, standing or sitting, is Ahmed Ceylan, the friend that I was talking about then, who gave me the inspiration and the incentive to do this project, and there's his mother Gulpuri. So there they are in New York at the time, and Ahmed, my friend Ahmed Ceylan, has fond memories of Ahmed Robenson, driving them around Tarrytown, giving sweets to him and his brother, etc. This is the final resting place of Ahmed Robenson. You may have just caught a glimpse of it in that earlier spot I showed. This is the gingerbread cottage on the Lyndhurst estate, the Hudson River behind, and that's where so-called Spencer J. Robenson died on the 3rd of October 1965. This is interesting because Ahmed Robenson kept changing his name. He kept changing his name to using his brother's names. I mean, he didn't use the name Peel Harold Robinson when he was in the United States. Spencer was his oldest brother. Why he was using the name of his oldest brother, I still can't quite fathom. And other members of the family, his godchild, who lives in Leicester now, who unfortunately couldn't quite come today, he would get parcels, his family would get food parcels for Ahmed Robenson in the 1950s, at the time when there's food rations, and he was then known as Uncle Bernard. So different names. Patriot or Internationalist. A patriot, term patriotism, I think, is sort of becoming a pejorative term these days. But patriot can mean, you know, sentiment to one's homeland, a feeling of attachment to one's homeland, which could be via a school, a sports team connected with that homeland, where you feel responsibilities for your homeland. You feel shame if your homeland country is perceived to be responsible for any wrongdoings. A liberal internationalist feels part of the broader international community, maybe 11th time, cosmopolitanism, promoting peace, prosperity, freedoms between different peoples and states. I argue that you can be both a patriot and a liberal internationalist. And Ahmed Robenson, I argue, was trying to be both. He was trying to be receptive to outside cultural ideas and movements, which he believed could bolster the prosperity, the well-being, the good of his new home in Constantinople. He was ideally situated as a bridge straddling England, Ottoman Empire. And I argue that he would become increasingly frustrated by hardline nationalists who would sabotage his projects or who would accuse him of being a spy. And for that reason, I think a frustrated Ahmed Robenson would emigrate to the United States, and then, in his later life, he would spin this counter-narrative. Yes, my family was important. Yes, my mother was famous, etc., etc. I think that was partly his revenge for the way that he'd been treated and that the members of his family had been treated earlier, casting suspicions on the loyalty of him and his mother and his family. In the end, then, one can say that Ahmed Robenson achieved a lot, and I really do empathise with quite a lot. I do feel of all the characters in the book, I felt most of an affinity towards him. But I do think that although he achieved a lot, he could have still achieved far more if circumstances had allowed, and if he had not emigrated to the United States and become an Oriental love seller. Thank you very much.
Thank you so much. All new to me how interesting sports history can be, and a very definite closing of horizons with the establishment of the Turkish Republic by Mustafa Kemal. Now there's some time for questions. My question is, did he not appeal to Mustafa Kemal, whom he had known from the evidence of the photographs?
I'm sure that, as you saw in that photograph, that they were connected. To what extent, I've not picked that up in any letters or correspondence, but also interestingly, in some of Ahmed Robenson's earlier, when he was a sports teacher before the First World War, he wrote some articles about the importance of sport for development of youth and education, which would really be exactly in line with the sort of things that Ataturk was pushing in 1923. So that's quite interesting. So I'm wondering to what extent Ahmed Robenson had some input into Ataturk's sort of thinking of education, pedagogical practices at that time. So I'm sure they definitely did know each other, they definitely had connections with one another, and that's an issue which I think could be explored further.
There's a definite connection, because Latife, Mustafa Kemal's wife, was the relation with the man who just cared about and she was a relation with Boris Latife.
Come back to Boris.
They would definitely have known each other.
Any more questions? Any questions? No. Well, please remember, 18th of September, our next meeting, we have talks on paintings of Izmir and on the names to be found in the Protestant cemetery of Feriköy in Istanbul, which henceforth include Professor Norman Stone, another British citizen who found his homeland in Turkey. And please remember to join our society, help us, give ideas. We also need help with fundraising. Anyway, now we should give our speakers a final round of thanks, and those who booked for dinner go.